Hi everybody and welcome back to Music History 2. Today's class, in two parts, is kind of a short and dirty history of the sonata and symphony. Now, as you probably know, both of these forms, particularly in the 18th century, are closely intertwined in that they follow a very similar concept in terms of their form. And also, historically speaking, they developed really almost in a parallel way in the 18th century, so that it makes a lot of sense to talk about them in one and the same class. When you look throughout music history, the terms sonata in Italian or sinfonia kind of mean different things depending on when exactly the term is used. For example, the term sonata, which comes from Italian suonare, which means to play, was just to indicate that this piece of music was not sung, but played. And that's important in the uprise of instrumental music in the 17th century, when composers more composed pieces that were actually instrumental music, and that's why they indicated this is a sonata. It needs to be played, and it is not sung. Now, the sinfonia has a similar connotation. It comes from Greek, and you know the first syllable, S-Y-M, sim, like in symbiosis, always means something that is comes together. And phonein in ancient Greek means to sound, so something that resounds together. And in the 17th century was used for both vocal music and instrumental music, but eventually becomes the standard term for a sounding together of music at the beginning of an opera. And it's indeed in opera, and particularly in Italian opera, that we have to look for the origins of the sonata and the symphony as we describe it today. You're probably thinking, oh yeah, sonata form, exposition, development, recap. The 18th century is really the time when that development happens. Although the terms, as I just said, are actually at least 150 years older than that, and actually also mean something different, or not as specific or as formally specified as they are in the 18th century, which we're talking today. So the symphony, or sinfonia in Italian, describes a piece of music that is the introduction to an opera. Now, today you would call that an overture, but at the time in late 17th century Italy, it was mainly referred to as sinfonia. And although that began kind of its story as a one movement thing, so one piece of music that doesn't really change meter, tempo, or mood all that much, towards the end of the 17th century, we find more and more the standardizing of a piece of music that has three sections. The first one is fast, the second one is slow, and the third one is fast again. So fast, slow, fast, and is the introduction to an opera. Can be both serious or comic opera, which we're going to talk about pretty soon in our opera days. But suffice it to say that this becomes the standard introduction, and this piece of music is really not part of the opera in those they were actually replaceable, so the opera itself didn't actually typically necessarily come with a sinfonia, but really any sinfonia could be played, and the function that it had was to introduce the opera, to tell people to now please sit down, shut up, and the opera is about to begin. So it's not even to be imagined that the opera is quiet yet, or the audience is in their seats yet. No, that's the music, basically like the intermission signal in concert houses today. That was kind of the function of the sinfonia or the symphony, to introduce the beginning of the opera. Now, the history of opera is, of course, closely intertwined with Italy, and particularly the history of comic opera begins all the way down in the south and travels further and further north and then over the Alps into Austria, Germany, and the countries north of the Alps. And therefore, it is actually Italian composers that travel to Germany and Austria that bring the idea of the Sinfonia from south of the Alps and Italy into the north. One of these composers, for example, is Nicola Porpora. And when you look at his biography, you already see he is, in fact, one of those figures that came all the way from the south. He was born in 1686 in Naples, so all the way in the heel of Italy. But during his lifetime, he was one of the most important music teachers for several very, very famous names, including the castrato Farinelli and Joseph Haydn, whom we'll talk about in a few classes from now. Haydn does not have a lot of very good recollections about Porpora's personality. In fact, there is a quote where he says, "There was no lack of asino, coglione, birbante," and that means ass, the animal, a-hole, and rascal. So Porpora must have had a rather juicy way of speaking. Anyway, so there was no lack of that. And pokes in the ribs, but I put up with it all, for I profited greatly from Porpora in singing, in composition, and in the Italian language. So that shows you that strong influence that composers such as Porpora had on the education of the next generation of composers north of the Alps. Another example is Niccolò Jomelli, who was also born in southern Italy, in Aversa, in 1714, so he's a little bit younger, and died in Naples, but throughout his lifetime was mainly active also north of the Alps, particularly in Stuttgart, where he became the Kapellmeister to Duke Karl Eugen of Württemberg, and also through that way imported Italian operas and, of course, along with those, opera sinfonias into the realm north of the Alps. I also wanted to show you this picture from a performance of the Teatro Regio in Torino in Italy from 1741 that depicts an opera performance and shows you that there is an orchestra in the front of the stage. It's not really a pit, it's just an area in front of the stage. And when we look a little more closely, here's the orchestra seated with two harpsichords, the high strings, violins, and violas, and also oboes are kind of placed around a big table, some of them sitting to the audience with their backs, and the bassoons and cellos on the one side with the Kapellmeister, typically also the double bass and one of the cello players playing from the same music as the Kapellmeister. And on the other side, also some basses and two horns. And that's something I want you to keep in mind, that the orchestral makeup at this point typically is strings. So two violins, first violin, second violin, viola, and a continuo group consisting of cello, bass, and a keyboard instrument that also plays chords, along with typically two oboes and two horns. That's the very typical orchestral makeup in the mid-18th century. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Now I want to look a little bit at what the state of the art, if you will, is in terms of the form of both the sonata and the symphony. In particular, we're looking at the form of the first movement, since that becomes a real standard format, as you know, while the second movement the slow movements very often can follow different formal models, and that's also true for last movements that can't be dance movements or finale movements. So we're, for our purposes here, only looking at the first movement format. Now, the history of the sonata and the symphony, as I mentioned earlier, are really very, very closely intertwined. Little by little, those fast, slow, fast sections of opera symphonias become longer and more individualized, so that they really no longer constitute sections of one and the same piece, but could really be referred to as movements. And so the first movement of such a sinfonia is very closely related to the first movement of the sonata. I just want to make one quick footnote, because now we know the sinfonia is for orchestra typically. In this case, the string to oboe to horn combination that we see around mid-century. But what is the sonata for? And there we already saw a really good example in one of the last videos when we looked at the keyboard sonata for amateurs and connoisseurs, remember, by C.P.E. Bach. And that was composed for keyboard. Now, keyboard music becomes a really, really important aspect in the history of 18th century music. Why? Because, first of all, there's a great new invention being made, and that's the invention of a piano, or let's say a keyboard instrument, that has a hammer action. So when you press a key, a hammer strikes the string. And that invention is made by actually an Italian harpsichord, clavichord, keyboard maker by the name of Bartolomeo Cristofori. And Cristofori didn't really know what to call this instrument. And so, because unlike the harpsichord, this particular instrument could play both loud and soft. And mind you, the particular new effect was actually the soft, not the loud, because the harpsichord is kind of loud. But this piano could also, when played more quietly, play really, really softly. And that was the new and fabulous thing. And so he called it actually clavicembalo col piano e forte, which basically means a harpsichord with piano and forte. And that term eventually developed into the pianoforte, and today we just call it the piano. And that didn't take off quite immediately that it became super, super successful. We saw that Frederick II at his court around mid-century, in the 18th century, so around 1750, already owned some prototypes of this new instrument, but it was really only in the second half and towards the end of the 18th century that the piano with the hammer action becomes really, really successful. And of course, for this new instrument, played by a new group or ever-growing group within society, which is the middle class, and the amateurs and connoisseurs, also requires or demands completely new quantities of music. And so, what type of music are you going to compose? And this is where the sonata comes in. The sonata is really, in terms of chamber music, the main format of music composed in the second half of the 18th century. Now, in one of the previous videos, I also told you that influenced and inspired by the Enlightenment and this whole notion of rationalization of things such as literature, but also education, but also instrumental playing. In this context, also the first very, very thorough composition treatises are being written. And probably one of the main composition treatises of the later 18th century is by German music theorist Heinrich Christoph Koch, who lived between 1749 and 1816. It's an introductory essay to composition that he published in 3 really thick volumes between 1782 and 1793. I'm bringing this up because Koch develops a really interesting concept of sonata form, and it's quite different from how we look at it today. Hopefully you already know about it because you read the reading for today, and it's very well described in the book actually. And I want to bring it up again because I think it's a very interesting way to look at sonata form. Historically speaking, of course, Koch, for his readers, needed to explain this new format in terms that they could understand. And the concept of sonata form that we are used to today is actually a very recent, or at least comparably recent theory, because it was really only established by music theorists after Beethoven had died. So sonata form, as you're being taught today in music theory, is really a concept that was established in the 1840s, 1850s. Whereas in the 18th century, Koch is a good example for a more historical point of view in terms of how to describe this new form. And he describes it with the means of music that people at the time would know, and that's of course mainly dance music. You probably remember from a previous music history class that the main format of instrumental music during the Baroque period, or one of those main formats, was dance music. And dance music is typically in A-B form, where both parts, A and B, are repeated, and the A part has typically a tendency to modulate from the tonic to the dominant, and the B part kind of does the reverse thing, okay? And so this is what Koch thought, well, everybody kind of knows that, so I'll explain this new format with those means. And so he says, in his understanding of sonata form, a sonata form has 2 parts to it. And that kind of makes sense because when you look at any sonata form movement, typically what you find in the middle is the double bar with the repeats of both parts. And so he says those are the 2 parts of sonata form. Then he says the first part typically consists of 4 phrases. 2 in the tonic, 1 that's modulating to the dominant, and the 4th one that confirms the dominant as the new key. Then he says the second part really consists of 2 subsections. Subsection 1 can pick on any thoughts that or phrases that were introduced before and can also add new material. However, it must at the end modulate to the tonic, where then, as the second subsection, a recapitulation needs to occur. But in other words, the development and the recap, in his understanding, are the B part of the form, and the exposition is the A part. Now, that's of course theory, and it's actually not even all that easy to find a piece that does exactly what Koch says that a sonata form needs to do. But the authors of our book actually have found one example where the music does exactly what Koch says, and that is in a sinfonia. So it's actually not even a sonata, which again shows you how close these 2 genres are. Sinfonia for strings by Italian composer Giovanni Battista Sammartini, who was mainly active in Milan, so in the northern part of Italy. And Sammartini is particularly associated with the development of the symphony as a standalone genre and no longer connected necessarily to an opera. Let's have a look at a sinfonia that he composed around 1740. It's very short, and it contains those 2 sections that Koch says, and it even contains the number of phrases that Koch suggests. It begins with phrase 1, as Koch says, needs to be in the tonic. And here is phrase 1. Very good phrase 1, no? It's all in octaves, and it's basically just a cadence. And very significant, very memorable. So a really good beginning for a symphony, I would say. Then we come to phrase number 2. That's very short, and is actually only one motive that's just repeated. And then he starts to modulate. Remember, Koch says phrase number 3 needs to modulate to the dominant. So this piece is in F major, so the dominant is C major, and typically we get there through the dominant of the dominant, so that's G. And that's exactly what Sammartini does here. That's G. Last phrase. Just confirming that new key of C major. And then we go back and play it again as the repetition of the A part. But it's pretty cool, no? It's a very funny piece, very witty, and really uses only the minimum of component parts that Koch requires. Now, let's go on and look at the B section. So he says it can pick up on any thoughts from before or any musical phrases from before, but can also introduce new ones and typically modulates around a little bit. So Koch does exactly that. First, he picks up on phrases that we've already heard, particularly in this case, the first phrase, and then he goes, aha, with a dominant 7th chord, he modulates, and then he actually brings in something that we haven't heard before. Modulates. Remember, Koch said at the end you gotta modulate back to the tonic key because now the recap needs to happen. And Sammartini does that in the cheapest way possible. He's still in C, and you think he's gonna go C, but no, the last chord is. Leads us back to F major, and that's exactly what he does. We've heard all that. But of course now, since the piece is going to be over pretty soon, we can't modulate to the dominant anymore, but the music needs to be changed such that it stays in the tonic so that we can finish in the tonic, and that's exactly what he does. And now with the material that originally modulated, he does almost modulate, but not quite. Listen to it. So he just finished around the corner that he didn't actually modulate, but stayed in F major, where we now just have to close the movement. Now listen to what that sounds like with an orchestra. Pretty witty piece, no? I think this is a great example for all of the things that we've talked about so far. The new genres, sonata and sinfonia form, the new taste that's really, really popular and fashionable in around mid-century of the 18th century. This very, I don't want to say simplistic, but very natural, very non-complicated harmonical language, very melody-driven, and written in such a way that you almost want to whistle it as you walk down the street. And that's this new flavor of music that's very, of course, very Italianate, very Italian-inspired, that's becoming really, really popular and fashionable in the center of Europe around plus minus 1750, and is, if you compare it to J.S. Bach's music, for example, completely different in its also mainly homophonic structure, melody-driven, simpler harmonic language. Those are the takeaways. Plus, please also remember those two interpretations of sonata form, if you will. On the one hand, Koch's model that talks about a two-part form with the four thoughts or musical phrases in the A section that modulate towards the dominant. Mind you, he never talks about a number of themes. He just calls them musical phrases, and they can be four, actually. It does not talk about a main theme and a second theme, okay? That's one of the interesting takeaways here. And then in the second part can introduce either the musical phrases from before or can introduce new material and typically modulates, and then the recap. But that's the B section, as opposed to the modern interpretation of sonata form that you probably already know from music theory anyway, where sonata form is a three-section model with an exposition with two distinct themes and a development and a recap at the end. And so if I asked you on an exam, what's the difference between those two models? Now you know what the difference is. And that concludes the first part of today's video. After the break, we'll be back with a little bit more history of the symphony, which takes us to Mannheim. So stay tuned.